It's a man's thing to be far away. It's the woman's thing to faithfully wait. Most probably, lots of you are familiar with this proverb from the early 20th movies of the last century, black white movies in particular, where the woman is sitting at home faithfully waiting for his husband while the husband is just on a trip fighting to earn a piece of the bread for the family. Yet, in a world where the lines once drawn in stone between man and woman, boy and girl, have blurred beyond recognition, we now find ourselves adrift in a sea of shifting identities. No longer is there the certainty that once anchored our understanding of self, a world where to be a man meant strength, authority, and stability, and to be a woman meant grace, nourishing, softness, weakness, and all the qualities we connect with the term femininity. Today, the lines that in fact demarcate these roles have been redrawn so many times that the original boundaries have become unrecognizable, submerged beneath a reed and very tide of fluidity, a kind of a personal expression, and some might argue even confusion. Take, for example, the case of an imaginary person, let's say, call him Benedict, a man who grew up with the clear expectation that his masculinity was tied to his ability to lead, protect, and provide. His father and his grandfather and the main generations behind embodied these qualities with an unwavering sense of duty and pride. Yet, Benedict now, in his 30s, finds himself in a world where such values are not only questioned, but often dismissed as relics of an oppressive past. He watches, somewhat bewildered, as gender is reimagined, redefined, or, in some circles, seemingly erased altogether. The simple dichotomy of male and female, boy and girl, man and woman has been, let's say, splinters into an array of identities, pronouns, and expressions, each demanding recognition and a new form of revalidation. For Benedict and many like him, this cultural shift presents more than just a challenge. It represents a profound destabilization of identity per se. What does it mean to be a man when society no longer offers a clear definition of manhood? What does it mean to be a woman when the very concept of womanhood seems up for some debate? And perhaps most disconcerting of all, what happens when identity becomes so fluid, so lucid, so open ended that it threatens to lose all the semantic meanings we once knew and could be found in a classical dictionary. As gender becomes a field of personal choice, subjective experience, and social negotiation, we are left to question whether the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction. Have we, in our rush to dismantle the conservative structures of identity, lost something vital in the process? Are we in danger of creating a world where identity is not celebrated but commodified? Where the very notion of self is fragmented into countless ever shifting pieces? Today's episode dives into these very questions, examining the erosion of traditional gender boundaries and the rise of a culture where identities, once firm and recognizable, are now fluid, elusive, lucid, and at times even incomprehensible. We will navigate these complex terrain with a critical eye, challenging the assumptions of modern identity and modern identity politics, and questioning whether the liberation from the old conservative categories has left us unmoored in a world where who we are is less certain than ever before. Hi, my name is Farshid, and you're listening to Orientalistics podcast on language, culture, and religion. Just a quick note at the very beginning. Since a few episodes back, I have been recording my ongoing lectures and episodes as both video and audio. I'm using this material for my YouTube channel as well. But just to clarify, what you see in the video is really just a reflection of my homepage and podcast episodes. It's mainly for capturing the video visually, so it doesn't really directly relate to the discussions ongoing. And it's simply a chance for me to share these episodes in both audio and video formats. Our discussion today is around identity and gender. Identities are far from being universal, and I discussed that in the um, last few episodes. They're not fixed, they're not innate. They don't exist in some timeless, unchangeable form, but are instead shaped and modeled by particular historical and cultural landscapes we find ourselves in. In other words, our identities are purely cultural constructs, as I mentioned that before. They cannot exist outside of the ways in which they are represented in language and society. We are, in a sense, made up of stories and descriptions we tell about ourselves, to us, but also to others. Stories in which we are deeply emotionally invested in. Now, while these identities are culturally constructed rather than naturally given, this doesn't mean we can simply swap out one identity for another, especially when it comes to something as deeply rooted as ethnicity or sexual identity, which is actually the core of my discussion today. These are not interchangeable labels. Even though they are social constructs, they shape us through the forces of power imposed on us and the psychological bonds we form with them. Nowhere is this more evident than in the realm of gender, where the shift from male to female or vice versa remains a radical and complex transformation. The way we understand gender and sex is largely dependent on how we talk about them, how society, through language, constructs femininity and masculinity. It doesn't mean that biology is irrelevant, far from that. And it's not like that we should be indifferent towards the concept of gender. But what it does emphasize is that the way we experience gender is more about cultural conservations and than universal biological facts. Gender identities are hence not fixed manifestations of some innate essence. Instead, they are cultural narratives that we embody. Judith Butler's influential work has been pivotal in, let's say, reshaping how we think about gender in the modern world, drawing from various fields like speech act theory, focus, discourse analysis, and psychoanalysis. Butler argues that sex itself is a regulatory norm, a kind of societal rule book that dictates how gender should be expressed. According to her, and I'm quoting, gender is something we are compelled to perform, a social construct that we, in fact, reenact um, through pressures of cultural discipline and psychological identification. Judith Butler doesn't see gender as something we simply choose to perform like an actor on a stage. Rather, it's a performance that is enforced by regulatory discourses of power. The law of society, she says, especially under the pressure of the heterosexual norms, demands that we continually perform and repeat these patterns of gender roles. Of course, here, Judith Butler is heavily influenced by by the other French intellectual Michel Foucault, and I have my own critics about that. So, according to Judith Butler, gender isn't something naturally given by nature or culture, but something created through constant, repeated performances. Yet, while Butler's idea about performativity and compelling reasons that she's bringing, they might be very convincing, they remain largely theoretical in my view and rather more philosophical. What her work doesn't fully capture is how, on a patriarchal, let's say day to day level, sex and gender identities are actually lived and performed in everyday life. We need to dig deeper into the way these societal rules, quote unquote, of gender are played out in conversations and interactions that make up our identity lives. And I will bring some examples, recording some interviews that I had with the others, but in a anonymous form. And through that, I'm trying to elucidate that the concept that Judith Butler, in fact, introduces is just partially comprehensible and implementable. Take, for example, the concept of masculinity. How is it constructed in everyday speech? How is it, in fact, deployed for specific purposes in the flow of ordinary conversation? This is where discourse analysis becomes a valuable tool, of course. It can help us, for example, how to uncover regulatory discourses of sex and gender and how they are articulated and performed in seemingly mundane exchanges that make up our everyday experiences. It's in it's quite and detailed empirical investigations that we can truly understand how these social and societal constructs play or play out in our real life. The study of gender within the history of the of institutional cultural studies has traditionally focused on the investigation of woman by woman, often framed uh, explicitly within a feminist context and a feminist ideology. Not that I would have anything against this methodology, by far not, but we're going to see that it has its own challenges. There is now a growing body of literature, of course, meanwhile, dedicated to the examination of masculinity as an oppose or opposition to that very classical ideas of feministic approach to identity that was very fashionable in late 90s. This increasing interest in men is reflected by the regular appearance of features on various aspects of masculinity in newspaper supplements and women's magazines, even radical critics of masculinity, which previously framed it as a, let's say, bedrock of misogyny, are now being or beginning to offer more nuanced and sympathetic, let's say, examinations of man's lives. This new focus on man is often driven by concerns over a perceived destructiveness of contemporary masculinity, ranging from naughty boys to bad men. Some gender studies even suggest that nearly 50% of men in the United States will, at some point in their lives, be implicated in issues such as depression, suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, or crime. Uh, Another study, for example, in New Zealand and Australia, shows that over 35% of boys in their early teenage years had engaged in binge drinking within the previous 2 weeks, and 55% of men under 24 reported drinking at levels deemed hazardous or harmful to their lives. I don't want to generalize those Australian and New Zealand statistics uh, to United States or elsewhere in the Western world, but there are similar census about drug abuse and alcoholism within the youth of the male background in those societies as well. Now, such statistics reflect a significant social and health crisis, with reports from government health surveys detailing the immense costs of the state and the vast human tragedy these issues represent. And why I'm starting this episode with those horrific statistics has a particular reason. The findings suggest that men are more likely than women to suffer from a range of serious health and social issues, including obesity, childhood diagnosis of mental disorders such as attention deficit disorders, ADD, and higher rates of HIV infection. Men are also 5 times, according to those census, are more likely to experience accidents and 6 times even more likely to die by suicide. Over 80% of the suicides of victims being male, particularly among those aged between 20 and 24 and over 80. These are the census from Japan, from Germany, from England, from Australia, and even from the United States and Canada. So, now in this sense, psychotropic research indicates that uh, low self esteem, often rooted in family life, combined with a failure to meet cultural expectations of masculinity, underpins much of the depression and drug abuse observed among young men. This is There are, of course, compelling evidence even to suggest that personal pain and anxiety and depression drive much male behavior that to an um, outsider may appear as needless self destruction. Men's engagement in violence, sex addiction, drug abuse, gambling, and substance abuse can be understood, therefore, as a form of self medication, a kind of defensive mechanism against covers depression, reactive depression, often triggered by shame and dysfunctional family relationships. However, relinquishing these coping strategies often leads to a collapse of self esteem, leaving men vulnerable to overwhelming depression as they struggle to maintain a sense of identity and worth. There is a growing consensus that the most effective treatment for depression is a combination of antidepressant medication and psychotherapy. The roots of depression are often a complex mix of genetic predispositions, of course, and, and biochemical factors deeply intertwined with what we call it as family traumata. One of the most intriguing aspects of contemporary research in this regard is the mounting evidence that personal experiences and the ways in which we think can actively reshape the brain's biochemistry. This means that childhood traumata, for instance, can leave lasting psychobiological consequences on men with post traumatic stress disorder, representing an extreme example of how traumatic events or profoundly affect the brain. It's not, of course, particularly just tailored to men. It's both about women and men. But these studies that I'm delving in are rather focusing on males. Furthermore, the emotional identifications described in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theories, which suggest that disorder connects to psyche, can also be understood through the lens of biochemistry. The emotional shifts sought through therapeutic conversations are linked to biochemical changes. Language, in this sense, reaches into the depth of body and influencing the every aspect of those processes of our biological makeup. Research on primates, for example, shows that separation from the mother causes changes in serotonin levels and adrenal enzymes activity, further reinforcing the idea that psychological experiences can influence biochemistry and biochemical processes. There is also growing evidence that changing our thought patterns can alter brain biochemistry. For example, learned pessimism, which some researchers cite as a significant cause of depression, can be countered by developing an optimistic outlook, a change that is believed to affect the body's biochemistry. So, in this sense, optimism uh, seems not only to boost mental health, but also strengthens the immune system, highlighting the power of thought to influence the physical body and effectively dissolving the mind body destruction. And and this mind body distinction, of course, this is more theoretical, how a person could change his ideology from a pessimistic point of view to an optimistic one. But the studies often say that this autosuggestive approach towards optimism would benefit the mind and body, and if you look at that theologically, soul and body distinction. In line with cognitive behavioral approaches, patterns of thinking and behavior are closely intertwined. Um, and as suggested, new ways of describing emotional pain lead to new pain behaviors, indicating that the let's say rewriting of the self through psychotherapy involves more than just words. It leads to changes in both conduct and underlying biochemistry. I don't want to tackle a lot and dip into the era to the idea of and the area of the biochemistry, which is not my profession. I just mentioned some research and their outcomes. It's a critical idea in most types of psychotherapy that the relationships and attachments we form as adults often replay um, aspects of our childhood experiences. For many men, life becomes a construct um, and kind of a constant quest for love and validation, driven by deep seated feelings of inadequacy, which are often rooted in the psychological and biochemical effects of family dynamics. Growing into an independent adult and developing a self narrative requires breaking free from those so called uh, parent child bonds. Now, when it comes to trauma, for example, we tend to think of extreme cases like sexual abuse or post traumatic distress disorder as the most damaging one. But for many men, it's not always the most dramatic events. It's the search for more nuanced, everyday forms of neglect or petty violence in childhood that stay with them. Physical abuse, of course, leaves scars, but often it's the lack of care, indulgence, and the absence of uh, um, let's say nourishing of or guidance that lingers the longest. When a child is hurt by a parent, a common reaction is to take on the blame in order to keep that crucial emotional connection with the parent. A child might conceive himself like it's my fault. I made them angry. I made my mom angry. I made my dad angry. There is something wrong with me. And this desperate attempt to maintain a sense of security can shape a child's entire view of himself. All of these points uh, to how a child's mind uh, adapts to protect his attachment to parents, even in the face of a daily mistreatment, is quite interesting. By internalizing shame or guilt, the child finds a way to, let's say, preserve the bond between himself or herself and the parents. This shame becomes ingrained, often um, persisting long after the abuse has ended, becoming a fundamental part of child's personality in his adulthood. As adults, survivors of abusive environments may continue to see themselves in a negative light, carrying the burden of their abusers' shames and guilt. Take, for example, the same imaginary figure I mentioned earlier in the prologue, Benedict. He knows he needs to confront his past, but he's afraid of what might happen if he does. He says, I haven't let it out yet because if I do, I'll do damage and go destructive. So I just try not to open the Pandora's box or the bottle. In saying this, Benedict both shields himself from responsibility and casts himself away at the same time as a kind of hero, holding back the potential destruction that could follow. It's clear that Benedict wants to deal with his emotions, but also dreads the pain that comes with facing them head on. He says he cannot cry, but it seems likely that he could. But if only he would let himself to do so. He needs a way to talk about himself, about his feelings, a language that makes it okay for men to cry, and more broadly, a way to express his emotions without fear. What's important here isn't about blaming Benedict for his pain. Rather, it's about recognizing how critical language is in shaping not just his perception of himself and his past, but also in helping him work through the legacy of toxic parenting. Toxic parents come in all forms, whether they are abusive or they have been abusive, neglectful, controlling, or simply incompetent of being good parents. The result for those mistreated as children is a sense of powerlessness and fear that often leads to repeating the same unhealthy patterns in future relationships, whether is it with another woman or with men, and etc. In only through finding the right words and taking emotional responsibility that these cycles can be in fact interrupted and broken. If this doesn't happen, people often return to self-destructive behaviors or find themselves in, let's say, more painful relationships. The idea of the inner child is a popular metaphor in therapy, illustrating how we internalize the emotional language and behaviors from our early experiences. Otherwise, the term inner child wouldn't have any semantic. Children who suffer trauma absorb feelings of shame and worthlessness, but they also internalize the voices of their abusers. In one conversation, for example, Benedict described a haunting image of himself. I quote, I picture myself in a corner, crying in a dark room with my head in my hands. I haven't let it out because if I do, I'll do damage. When Benedict was asked if letting it out would lead to the boy in the corner crying, he responded, yes, one day he will. These metaphors of bottling up or opening the Pandora's box emotions suggest that feelings are something inside of us waiting to be released. By emotions, I mean all those findings that a person could have in his childhood and adolescence. But emotions aren't, um, let's say, um, especially locked like that. I mean, they are biochemical responses in our bodies as well, influenced by the words we use to describe them. For Benedict, for example, is not just about releasing emotions from a metaphorical bottle or like a Pandora's box. It's about learning how to manage and control those bodily reactions, what we typically call fear and anxiety, uh, that are triggered, of course, by memories of his childhood. In other words, while Benedict's body may respond automatically to those emotions, Benedict's brain can learn to regulate those responses, helping him take control of the fear, uh, let's say, circuits that operate outside of cautious thought. In Benedict's words, one day he will let it out, hints at the slow but necessary process of finding the right language to make peace with the past. So it was, in fact, a short episode. Now, let me wrap it up by taking a closer look at how we understand the formation and expression of identities and consider the resources we draw upon in this process. To start, it's important to recognize that modern identities aren't static or singular. Rather, they are woven together from a multitude of interacting and intersecting elements. Things like class, race, gender, age, and nationality. We don't merely have these different beliefs, attitudes, and backgrounds in a sense. We do, or we are these intersections. We are made up of constantly shifting wave of these different social and personal aspects, and crucially moving beyond a rigid essentialist idea of race or ethnicity. It doesn't mean we should forget the very real historical and social and societal factors that shape and, in fact, racialize different groups. If anything, by critiquing those essentialist ideas, we open up space for a more nuanced understanding of people as inherently multi dimensional and complex beings. Next, we can also consider how discourses around identity overlap and borrow from each other. A prime example is how race and gender often intersect. Take, for instance, the 19th century social Darwinism, which connected to the idea of race or connected the idea of race to the supposed progression of man. Nations, too, are often imagined as female. Think of how women's body have been symbolically tied to ideas about uh, bloodlines and ethnicity. Even more recently, there has been the push to embed gendered ideas into national identity, like the emphasis on mateship, for example, in Australian identity politics. In these cases, we see how certain ethnic or national identities are coded in specifically gendered ways, and how one group might, in fact, drive another by labeling them as weak or, let's say, effeminate. Thirdly, we can't ignore the fact that people navigate different social spaces where they are addressed and categorized in various ways. The idea of hybridity, where cultural identities mix and new forms of identity emerge, has been helpful in understanding this movement, of course. However, I need to be careful here. I mean, or we need to be careful. Not all hybridity is the same. Some scholars differentiate between a structural and cultural so-called hybridization. Structural hybridity refers to actual places or sites, like border towns or global cities, where different cultures converge. Cultural hybridity, on the other hand, is more about how people themselves respond, perhaps by assimilating into one culture or maintaining distinct identities, or by creating something entirely new that challenges and blurs cultural boundaries. This kind of cultural hybridization is, um, of course, um, quite exciting because it opens up new ways of being, but it doesn't mean that boundaries disappear altogether. Rather, it highlights how we can recognize both cultural differences and point of, let's say, community and communality at the same time. It's particularly useful to, let's say, in this manner, distinguish between two types of hybridity. One type involves people switching between distinct cultural traditions, often depending on the context, like how someone might identify both Asian or Middle Eastern and American or German. Moving between these expectations of a traditional, let's say, Asian household and the norms of, let's say, American youth culture. The other type is more about blending cultures to produce something entirely new, like, let's say, Iranian American or Latino American identities, which is really not entirely Iranian and but not entirely American, neither is entirely Latino nor entirely American. So, yet, even there, we have to be a little bit cautious talking about these hybrid identities, as they are a neat blend of two separate, homogeneous cultures, can be quite misleading, because German Italian or American culture are themselves already quite hybrids. They are internally diverse, shaped by religion, class, gender, and countless other factors. So, really, hybridization is the mixing of things that are already mixed to begin with. Now, despite these challenges, the concept of hybridity still helps us understand the emergence of new cultural identities. It allows us to see how categories like, for example, Iranian American aren't static but are result of cultural change. In this way, we can think of hybridity as a useful tool, a temporary lens through which we can capture and make sense of these dynamic cultural processes. It's not about it's finding a final answer, as you see, but it helps us to navigate the complexities of identity in a, let's say, quote unquote, globalized, ever changing world. That brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope that this has sparked some new perspectives on identity, gender, and language, and how they shape our world and our perception from the world. And if you enjoyed this discussion, feel free to share it with your family and friends. And please do not forget to write your feedbacks in the comment section. Until next time, take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.